The winter sky over eastern France looked like brushed steel, flat, heavy, full of secrets. In Lyon, the turnstiles clicked and squeaked as strangers threaded toward gate signs that glowed soft orange. Someone hummed through her scarf. A business traveler checked his watch twice, then once more. 2 seats over, a boy pressed a thumb to the frosted window and drew the letter R, which his mother wiped away with a mittened hand. Flight IT-148, an Airbus A320-111, would stitch Lyon to Strasbourg in under an hour, an ordinary line on a map traced tens of thousands of times before. It lifted at dusk with 96 souls aboard. Routine, predictable, safe, until it wasn't. They would never see the runway lights. Sleet feathered the Vosges, and the airplane slipped behind weather like a swimmer into fog. The cockpit was a universe of small numbers and small switches, translating human decisions into machine motion. On the A320, a few millimeters of a knob could mean angles or rates, degrees or feet per minute, a subtlety pilots learned and unlearned in the press of real time. On that January night, while descending towards Strasbourg, the aircraft's automation sat in a mode that punished a moment's imprecision, a design born in logic, not in mercy. Investigators would later point to mode confusion between flight path angle and vertical speed, and the absence, on this airline's jets at the time, of a ground proximity warning system, a last-chance voice that, had it been present, might have shouted the simplest word in aviation: terrain. Far below, Mont Sainte-Odile rose in dark timber. The hill took its name from a saint and its hush from the forest. Snow softened every hard edge. In the cabin, overhead vents whispered. Trays rattled as the first light turbulence made itself known. The boy with the wiped-away letter fished a paperback from his pocket and read a single sentence 4 times without understanding it, tired in the small way children get tired on night flights. A flight attendant, she had braided her hair in the crew room because it made the hat sit right, checked belts, smiled to a nervous man in 16C, and felt the way you feel when the day's work is almost done. A pivot toward meals at home, sleeping in your own bed. A hug that doesn't smell like jet fuel. In the cockpit, a number was set, 33. But the machine read it not as 3.3 grades of descent, the gentle slide a pilot might intend, rather as 3,300 feet per minute, a rate that in poor visibility, in a valley at night, shortens futures into seconds. Each instrument was truthful in its own language. Each human was working in good faith. The ice of tragedy often forms right there, on the boundary between languages that don't quite match. There is a kind of silence before impact that witnesses sometimes describe later, the way a room seems to hold its breath before a vase tips. At 1920 local time, that silence ruptured. Trees snapped like matchsticks, metal screamed, seats tore from rails, and the front of the cabin dissolved forward. The forest caught what it could, the rest was left to the mountain. 87 people would never go home. 9 would survive with injuries, thrown into a winter night they would have to outlast together. The boy woke to air that bit like teeth and a smell of hot plastic and pine sap. The world was tilted. Trees growing sideways, floor where ceiling should be. Somewhere a woman moaned, and somewhere else a man repeated, it's okay," the phrase breaking into syllables. A hand, anybody's hand, touched his shoulder. The flight attendant's hat was gone. Her braid was full of bark. She counted. Counting is how you start to claim a chaos. 1, 2, 3, 9. She told the boy to stay close. She told the young couple from Mulhouse to hold hands and not let go. She told the businessman from Lyon, who could not feel his feet, that he was not alone. They were not alone. They would be one unit now, a small republic of survivors, and their law would be warmth. Far below the ridges, phones began to ring. In homes across Alsace and Rhône, families stood to answer them, then sat back down with faces that suddenly seemed older. When officials say, "We have lost contact," what they mean is that time has split, and you have to live in both halves at once. The world where your person is walking through an arrival's door, and the world where a mountain is holding its breath. At Strasbourg, screens snapped to delayed, and then to contact lost, and grief arrived the way night does, slow from one side and then all at once. Back on the hill, the survivors began the ancient work of survival. They huddled, they shared coats, they shouted, they listened for engines. The cold did not care that they were brave. Courage is not a coat. They looked for light through the trees. The forest gave them dark and wind and the white noise of snow. Rescue would take hours to find this place. Terrain, weather, darkness, confusion on the ground delaying every step. And the night asked the nine to keep choosing each other, minute after minute, when minutes were heavy as stones. When people talk about unsolved tragedies, sometimes they mean the machine questions. Which knob, which mode, which chart? Sometimes they mean the human ones. Why did a warning system cost too much until it cost everything? Why do some decisions get measured in money and others in funerals? In France, this crash would grow into both kinds of questions, and the families would learn to carry them like lit candles that must not go out. When people talk about unsolved tragedies, sometimes they mean the machine questions. Which knob, which mode, which chart? Sometimes they mean the human ones. Why did a warning system cost too much until it cost everything? Why do some decisions get measured in money and others in funerals? In France, this crash would grow into both kinds of questions, and the families would learn to carry them like lit candles that must not go out. In the days that followed, France learned the names of the hill, the flight, and the people. Across living rooms and cafes, citizens did the arithmetic of empathy. If they were ours, what would we ask? We would ask for an investigation that tells the truth without flinching. We would ask for systems to be changed, not just words to be spoken. We would ask for accountability without vengeance, for safety without amnesia. And we would ask for a way, at last, to live again, not beyond the shadow, but with it, a companion we learn to walk beside. Morning brought a grey that could not decide whether to be day. Helicopters ticked the air to pieces and carried people in orange jackets up and down the slopes. The monastery nearby, a place built for prayer, became a staging ground for triage, maps, hot tea, and quiet places to cry. A line of cars wove slow along a road not meant for convoys, drivers pressing their palms to the steering wheel as if to keep steady the balancing act of useful sorrow, helping without breaking. Two narratives began to diverge and braid the way mountain streams do. The first was technical. Charts, knobs, modes, radio calls, approach design, and the absence of an onboard terrain warning voice that the families would come to know intimately by its acronym. The second was human. Names, weddings that would not happen, beds left cold, children taught a new vocabulary, bereavement too early. These narratives would feed each other for years. When courts convened, a number on a panel would be asked to account for one empty chair at a Sunday table. When engineers spoke, a widow would listen and ask her question in a tone that left no room for the usual defenses. If you had known it was your daughter's plane, would this have been enough? At the airports, Lyon and Strasbourg, the memorials grew with the strange symmetry of grief. Identical flowers, identical candles, different reasons. A child laid down a soft toy and did not understand why the adults cried harder at that. The airline's representatives read statements and bowed heads and answered questions they could answer, and promised to relay the ones they could not. Lawyers showed up carrying folders fat with precedent and thin on comfort. Journalists tried not to use the word miracle for the nine, because miracles make bad policy. The survivors themselves woke to white ceilings and questions. Where are we? Who else? Why me? In a hospital bed, a boy asked for his mom and was told the answer with care that shattered like glass when it hit the floor. The woman with the braid, sutures like fine stitches along her hairline, listened to a doctor say stable and decided she would one day weld that word to her life. She asked about the others. She asked about the families. She looked at her hands and understood that they were not empty. When the BEA and judicial authorities opened their binders, they began to talk about human-machine interfaces and trapdoors in design, how a decimal point can become a cliff in the fog if the machine will accept 33 as either degrees or hundreds of feet per minute, how a cockpit can be perfectly legal and still not safe enough, and how Air Inter's A320s at that time lacked GPWS, a choice ostensibly justified by operational preferences that collided in the worst way with a winter mountain. The families listened. They formed associations, carried photos into hearing rooms, and learned to speak both languages, the one of law and engineering, and the one of love. Years later, the courts would assign responsibility and compensation, numbers in euros applied like a bandage to a wound that does not understand currency. It was something, a legal recognition that choices and systems have owners, and it was also not nearly enough. The families said so plainly. They wanted safety work, warning systems installed, training clarified, approach procedures rewritten, interfaces redesigned, so that the next 9 or 90 would never have to make a republic out of a wreck and a night of snow. There was, and remains, an untold piece that belongs to those who were not on the hill, the caregivers who learned to carry other people's midnights, the first responders who replay, unbidden, the sound of boots on snow when the voices first came back, the investigators who went home to children after measuring impact angles by the centimeter, the priests and neighbors and quiet friends who identified their life's work as showing up. In this way, the story of Flight 148 is bigger than a single flight. It is about how a country remembers, how it changes, and how it refuses to accept that grief is the end of the sentence. On the January night of the crash, the cockpit of Flight 148 was a softly glowing constellation, amber digits, green tapes, white needles, each one a claim about reality. Modern airliners are built to translate air and gravity into numbers, then translate numbers back into motion. They are equal parts aircraft and agreement. But agreements only work when everyone speaks the same dialect. In the A320 of the early 1990s, the smallest rotary knob on the glare shield could summon 2 different languages, degrees or feet per minute. That knob lived at the hinge between human intention and machine obedience. And like all hinges, it was quiet right up until it wasn't. In training, pilots learned the modes by heart: selected heading versus managed heading, open descent versus vertical speed, flight path angle, FPA, which asks the airplane to hold a geometric slope, say 3.3 degrees toward the runway, versus vertical speed, VS, which simply dives or climbs at a rate, say 3,300 feet per minute, without caring where the ground is. FPA feels like drawing a straight, careful line with a ruler. VS feels like choosing how fast to go downhill and trusting you'll meet the road before the cliff. Both are legal, both are tools, both can kill if used where the other belongs. And when a cockpit lets 33 be read as either 3.3 or 3,300, the risk is not only that a crew will make a mistake, humans do that because we are human, but that the interface will conceal the mistake until it matters most. It is tempting, decades later, to imagine a villain hiding behind the instrument panel. There isn't one. There is instead a series of choices that made sense to someone at a desk, and a series of habits that made sense to someone in a cockpit, and the immutable physics of a winter mountain. Air Inter, with a business model built on brisk, short sectors, had operational preferences that shaped the way approaches were flown. Strasbourg's terrain and procedures shaped the way its valley had to be entered in bad weather. The early A320 architecture, revolutionary in many ways, still carried certain trapdoors of ambiguity, mode enunciations that were technically clear, but not humanly unmistakable when the workload spiked. None of that makes a headline. It does make a tragedy. Imagine the crew now. Needles alive, altimeters unwinding, the autopilot dutifully doing the last thing it was told. Outside, the Vosges had turned the night into a grayscale secret. Black for trees, white for snow, and no runway lights to interrupt the story. Inside, the altitude window showed a number they fully intended to honor. The 33 they selected, meant to shape the descent like a ramp, was not the ramp they got. In good visibility, the difference might have been caught by the eye, the paradox that the brain notices most swiftly when the horizon is honest with you. But this night hid the horizon, so the panel spoke its calm, numerical language while the ground came up fast in its own wordless one. If you've ever misread a medicine dosage, 1 pill instead of half, or set an alarm for 7 p.m., instead of 7 a.m., you have lived a tiny, harmless version of the same design problem. When two meanings live in the same box, stress will eventually choose the wrong one. Aviation solves this in layers: training, checklists, standard call-outs, cockpit ergonomics, warning systems. On Flight 148, one of those layers was missing, a voice in the box that, in so many other jets, would have cried, "Terrain! Pull up!" The airline did not equip its A320s with that last chance chorus in those years. They relied instead on procedures and awareness, the way a careful driver trusts mirrors and habits on a familiar road. Mirrors and habits are good until fog and fatigue and familiarity draw the map for you. The untold part, the piece families talk about when the cameras leave, is the long education that grief imposes. Mothers and husbands and sons learned acronyms they never asked to learn. They visited mock-ups, sat in chairs that faced switch panels, and asked patient captains to show them exactly where the FPA-VS selector sat, how it felt under the fingers, how the decimal would have looked on that winter evening. They learned about charting and minimum altitudes and the geometry of valleys. They learned that a datum can be true and still be inadequate to the moment, that a checklist can be followed and still be betrayed by context. None of this knowledge brought anyone home, but it turned bewilderment into a kind of agency, and agency is one of the few medicines that works on helplessness. The investigators, for their part, walked a careful line between causation and contribution. They had to say which factors were necessary for the accident to occur, and which were sufficient, and which were merely helpful to catastrophe. That last category, helpful to catastrophe, is where the moral questions live. A design choice that tolerates ambiguity is helpful to catastrophe. A training culture that normalizes workarounds is helpful to catastrophe. A procedure that threads an airplane between peaks on a stormy night without a technological safety net is helpful to catastrophe. When you stack enough of those helpfuls together, one more snow-laden branch is enough to drop the whole tree. And yet, the cockpit is also a place of professional devotion. It is important, morally important, not to rewrite the crew as careless. They were doing a job they were good at, in an airplane whose personality they understood, on a route that had become routine. Routine is both the blessing and the curse of safety. It frees bandwidth for judgment until it quietly takes judgment hostage. Ask any seasoned pilot what haunts them, and they will say, "The trap that feels like Tuesday." Flight 148 felt like Tuesday until, impossibly, it didn't. Years later, one of the survivors would describe the panel lights as stars that lied nicely, not because the instruments were faulty, but because they were polite in their certainty. That line, a stranger's poetry, found its way into the speech a family representative gave on an anniversary. "Let our systems be impolite when we need saving." Out of that plea came pressure, and out of that pressure came changes. Clearer mode displays, standardization in how numbers must be entered and shown, warning systems becoming less optional and more obligatory, briefings rewritten to name the trap out loud. A line in a manual cannot raise the dead, but it can refuse to make new ghosts. Back in the homes of Alsace and Lyon and Paris, the technicalities filtered down into bedtime language. A child asked, "Why didn't the plane know the mountain was there?" A father, fumbling, said, "Because we hadn't taught it to shout when it got too close." That is the heart of it. Not that we build perfect machines or perfect humans, but that we teach them to shout for each other when either one is wrong. The instruments will always talk in numbers. The humans will always hear in stories. Safety begins when those two dialects agree on the same ending. Arrivals board, carousel 3, door that opens, someone you love waiting on the other side. In the museum of memory that families carry, this chapter sits beside photographs and ticket stubs and the last voicemail saved on an old cassette. It is a room where the exhibit labels read mode confusion, interface ambiguity, missing layers of defense. But the room itself is quiet, almost tender, because behind the engineering there is always a person brushing snow from a stranger's hair, always a name spoken into cold air and answered. What the instrument said in the end was not descend or hold or capture. It was the same thing the human said, and the mountain said, and the years said, be clearer, be kinder, be loud when it counts. The mountain had a way of swallowing footsteps, snow over needles, needles over soil, soil over rock. Every sound seemed to get gentled, as if the Vosges itself were trying to hush what had happened. When the first teams reached the break in the trees, their headlamps swung through a new geometry. Seats at angles that shouldn't exist, aluminum peeled like skin from fruit, luggage open to the weather, as if the sky had rifled through it looking for names. One firefighter, young enough to still be surprised by his own fear, stopped and breathed into his scarf until he felt the shape of his chest again. Then he went to work. They had climbed in lines so no one would vanish, a rope in mittened fists, boots testing the slope before committing weight. Radios crackled with half sentences and coordinates that didn't quite match different maps. Darkness took things that light would later give back. Orange helmets became floating circles. Faces were all eyes. Somewhere below, a convoy idled and steamed. Somewhere above, the monastery held its breath, stone and prayer-sharing space with thermoses, blankets, and lists of names. The mountain had always been a place for pilgrims. Tonight, the pilgrims were the ones with stretchers. Survival, once you find it, has to be convinced to stay. The 9 had kept each other awake, with counting and stories, a kind of vigil that burnt calories they couldn't spare but kept a different fire lit. The one that says, in every language, stay with me. When the rescuers appeared, it was like new rules were issued to the night. Voices were suddenly plural and purposeful. Gloves touched pulses. A light danced an arc across a forehead and found pupils that obeyed. Names were asked gently, then written on tape and pressed to coats. Claire, Julian, Mart, labels that said to the chaos, these are people. The woman with the braid gave a briefing a captain would have admired. Injuries, what we have, who is best to move first, who needs to be kept very still. Authority wears many uniforms. Tonight hers was torn wool and a steadiness that could hold others up. Rescue on a slope is choreography. You think in triangles. Patient, rescuer, anchor. A sled is rigged. A strap bites into a shoulder and is ignored. The first meters are the hardest because gravity fights pride and pride wants to run. They didn't run. They inched, they checked, they kept talking. To the patients, to themselves, to the mountain as if it were a stubborn friend. At one point a rescuer began to hum, something without words, and the tune threaded through the trees in a way that made even the forest seem less sure of its silence. We've got you, someone said for the 7th time. Words can be ropes too. You can tie them around a person and feel them hold. Down the trail, a team with dogs worked a different grid, noses taking the night apart and bringing back pieces that made sense. Boot scuffs, human salt, a sweater's wool. The handlers spoke in praise and reward, 2 languages that dogs understand better than most people. One dog stopped hard and laid down, the signal it had been taught to give. The handler took off his glove and let warm fingers verify what the dog already knew. A wrist, a faint rhythm, a reason to shout. The shout went down the slope and up the radios and into a dozen bodies that moved all at once, but never lost their triangles. In the monastery halls, monks in brown habits ladled soup with hands that were also used to prayer beads. The soup was simple and perfect, the kind that tastes like someone sees you. Volunteers from nearby villages learned, in a strange hour, how to be quartermasters, stacking blankets, sorting gloves by size, deciding that the best place for the tea was on the third table, far enough from the door to stay warm. A nurse from a town you'd pass without noticing parceled out hot packs as if they were talismans. People who had never met suddenly loved each other for a reason they would never have chosen. Meanwhile, the airport waiting room was turning into a cartography of grief. A woman stood so still that someone draped a coat over her and she didn't notice. A teenager clutched a phone that alternated between full bars and no signal, as if the air itself couldn't decide how much to tell. A man who had just learned how to breathe again after losing his father 2 years ago now felt the air turn into glass in his throat. Officials spoke in voices that tried to offer facts as blankets. Facts are never blankets. Still, they laid them gently. We have reached the site. Survivors have been located. Transport is underway. Each verb was a bridge no one knew how to cross, but the verbs kept coming. Back on the slope, logistics fought physics. The narrow path took people in single file, which is a cruel shape when you need to move the hurt and the helpers, the gear and the grief, all at once. At a switchback, a sled caught and threatened to turn. 2 rescuers lowered their centers of gravity as if they could convince friction to be their friend. It worked. Small victories are how long nights pass. Above them, the sky had begun to admit that it was night, not an unmade day. A faint wind toyed with the tape on a medic's sleeve. Somewhere close, a branch gave up its snow, and the quiet, for a second, sounded like applause. There was a moment, every search has one, when tempers wanted to fray. A dispatcher demanded coordinates in a way that sanded the skin off a responder's patience. A volunteer, ignorant of how heavy a word can be, wondered aloud why it had taken so long. The team leader, who'd been looking at this mountain since before some of the medics were born, placed a palm against the trunk of a fir and shut his eyes just long enough to feel the roughness center him. He opened them and spoke a sentence that steadied the night. "We do not argue in front of the cold." It wasn't a rule they'd learned in any academy. It was the kind of sentence that comes from living near weather and learning what it takes. Stretchers began to arrive at the transfer point, a piece of road that had been convinced temporarily to accept ambulances and the brightness of their interiors. The first survivor squeezed a rescuer's hand with such precision, not hard but certain, that the rescuer would remember that pressure more than the view from any summit in his life. In the back of an ambulance, a paramedic narrated what she was doing: oxygen, warm blankets, checking for internal injuries, as if language itself could knit body to body. She promised things she could keep. "I'm staying right here. We're going to the lights now. I won't let go." It is not lying to promise the next 5 minutes when you cannot promise the rest. News traveled oddly up and down the mountain. Someone at the monastery heard that all 9 had been found and repeated it with a broad, exhausted smile. Someone by the wreck heard that only 3 had made it and kept working as if the numbers were a curse they could undo with effort. The truth, bordered by hypothermia and triage and the raw arithmetic of trauma, was messy and human. The teams worked the mess with discipline that looked like kindness. By the time the last survivor was transferred, the mountain's black had lightened by a shade too subtle to name. Night doesn't end all at once here, it unthreads. The searchers stood a little apart and let their joints complain. One of them, the young firefighter from the first ridgeline, peeled off his glove and found a line of bark pressed into his palm like a tattoo. He traced it with a thumb and understood that he had been marked by the work in a way he would carry into every other night of his career. He hoped, ferociously and suddenly, that all the training manuals would be rewritten to include this, the chapter on how to hold strangers long enough for daylight to meet them. At the hospital, a mother arrived at the same time as a gurney. A nurse who had seen reunions before and knew the math of pain still had to turn her face away for a second because tears make poor instruments. The mother spoke her child's name like it was both question and answer. The child answered with a hand that squeezed, the universal language of here. Outside, sirens came and went. Inside, the clocks were only occasionally useful. The monastery's chapel, which had borne centuries, now bore candles in a new configuration. Some were for the living, because we give light to those who survived, so they remember their way back. Some were for the dead, because we give light to those we cannot carry ourselves. The monks sang a hymn whose melody held without demanding translation. A rescuer slipped in at the back, helmet under his arm, and sat where he could see the door. He didn't pray. He just sat, and the sitting was enough. The pines kept their counsel. The mountain would still be there when the memorial stones were laid and when anniversaries taught families how to walk a calendar like a cliff path. But tonight, it had given back 9 people. It had taken 87. No math could reconcile that. What could be reconciled, and would be, was the question the families were already learning to ask in voices that would not lower. What will you change because we came up this road? The searchers, packing coils of rope and folding sleds and counting themselves 2 more times than necessary, had their own answer softened into their bones. We will be back, if called. We will bring more light. We will try to arrive sooner. The convoy eased away. The forest folded its branches over the path and began the long, slow business of remembering politely and forgetting what it had to. A single glove, dropped and found later by a hiker in spring, would become a talisman on a mantle in a little house not far from here. People find ways to keep the edges from cutting forever. Sometimes the way is a song. Sometimes it's a glove. Sometimes it's a vow spoken into the cold at the end of a very long night. This is not the end of the work. Airports are built for movement, not for staying. Yet the waiting room at Strasbourg that night learned a new purpose. It became a harbor for people whose boats would not leave. Someone pushed rows of plastic chairs into a crooked horseshoe, as if a new geometry could make grief easier to speak across. Someone else scouted outlets and began a quiet rotation of phones within reach of chargers, because in a crisis battery, life pretends to be hope. A handwritten sign appeared on the wall, family assistance, printed letters growing bolder as the pen pushed harder, as if ink could will certainty into being. The language of the room was now. Not yesterday when work had been ordinary and the car keys were where they always are. Not tomorrow, a country no one could bear to tour yet. Now, in which a man named Luke tried to remember the exact color of his wife's scarf that morning and became trapped in the shade between burgundy and wine. The remembering was a spell he repeated because it kept her present. A boy of 17, Karim, held a jacket that was not his, the heavy winter coat of his older sister, and refused to be convinced that it would no longer be needed. Across from him, an older woman named Colette placed a thermos on the table like an offering and asked anyone passing by whether they took sugar. This is how people keep a room from turning to stone. They pour tea, they hand out tissues, they organize the disorganized, they look for small doors back into ordinary. A liaison officer, shoulders squared by the weight of the badge and by something softer, guilt at carrying news that breaks, stood at the front and spoke carefully. There were survivors, he said, and injuries and transfers to hospitals in the city. The verbs landed like snow, visible, cold, accumulating on surfaces and in hair, making it hard to see what was underneath. He promised updates. He promised that no one would be left alone when answers arrived, even the answers that refused to deserve the name. Behind him, a whiteboard grew a column of times, 1940, 2005, 2110, and beside each a sentence, rescue on site, transport in progress, hospital assignments pending. The column became a spine for the room, a way to stand. Media gathered at the perimeter, lenses lowered for once. There is an etiquette to tragedy that even cameras learn. A woman from a radio station asked for permission to speak to the families and took no, with the same care she would have taken yes, later telling her editor that sometimes the news is a door you do not knock on. The security guard stationed at the only entrance set his jaw in a way that meant, I can carry part of this. People did, everywhere, carrying slices of each other's load, so the room, impossibly, could stay upright. What people said out loud fell into three categories. First, questions shaped like lifelines. Which hospital? Can I ride with the liaison? Is there someone who can help me call my mother? Second, facts pretended into being by repetition. He's strong. She's a runner. They will find them. Third, rituals that sounded like small talk but were anything but, do you want water? You should sit. I'll watch your bag. Even the silence was busy. It sorted and folded and made space for the next arrival. A chaplain from the city, black coat still damp with sleet, stood at the edge until invited inward. And then he did what the good ones do. He asked for names and kept them all, as if memory itself were a sacrament. A psychologist in a simple sweater set up a corner with 2 chairs and learned hundreds of seconds of 100 different lives. Pieces of biography spaced out with long gulps of air. She offered the words, shock, normal, not alone, and returned them as needed to anyone whose hands could not hold the news they were hearing. On a table, a volunteer arranged croissants that had no smell because grief gives the nose other work. Still, people broke them and passed pieces like currency because eating is a vote for the next hour. At intervals, new information entered the room like weather. A list of names, read quietly. A hospital, specified. A status, described too carefully to be misunderstood. Stable, critical, pending identification. Each word was a door a person had to walk through with witnesses. Some returned carrying a future, dented but intact. I'm going to the ambulance bay now. Others came back with a document and a calm that had been stapled on because shaking would not help. They will call us when we can see her. A few were taken aside to the small room with the softer light, the room every family notices immediately and prays never to enter. Inside that room, time becomes granular. Outside, time keeps its appointment with the whiteboard. Letters began, scribbled on airline napkins, on the backs of unused baggage tags, on offering envelopes taken from a box. The chaplain slid gently across the table. Dear Julian, one started. Written by a father whose boy was still missing. I am here. I will be here when you walk in. The writing itself steadied him, the way telling a story steadies a child before sleep. Another letter, this one to a husband believed to be among the survivors. They said you were cold. I'm sending you my coat in this sentence. I'm sending you soup with every comma. People learn quite suddenly how to make language do work it never trained for. Somewhere between midnight and morning, the room discovered that it had become a we. Families who had never shared anything now shared a map, a vocabulary, a row of chairs, a grief-appointed neighborhood. They began to circulate knowledge that did not fit on whiteboards. Which nurse at which desk would look you in the eye and use your loved one's name? Which elevator actually stopped at the ward the liaison meant? How to say please in a way that earned now. They shared phone chargers and passwords, and a blanket that had been intended for a lap, but wound up as a shawl draped around 2 sets of shoulders. When names of the living were spoken, applause rose, small and astonished, as if the room had witnessed birth. When names of the dead were given, the applause did not go away. It softened, became the kind of clapping you hear at the end of a requiem. Gratitude for the fact that a name has been carried across a dark river and placed, intact, into the hands of the living. People are good at inventing the rights they need. A teenager whispered the prayer he had learned from his grandfather. A woman who did not believe in God believed in the way the chaplain held her elbow when her knees flexed, and that was enough. At 3:17 a.m., a nurse from the emergency ward entered with a list and the kind of tired that makes kindness a discipline rather than a feeling. She spoke each name twice. Once for the room, once for the person who could not bear to hear it the first time. Hearing is a door that sometimes needs to be knocked on gently, again and again. After she finished, she did something no one had asked her to do. She put the list down and said, "If you want me to say your person's name into the quiet, I will." People lined up, not for updates, but for an incantation. She said names into the room like planting bulbs. Later, long after the bulbs would have flowered if they were actual bulbs, someone would remember not the list, but the way she said, "Etienne," and then waited for the air to stop trembling. By morning, the waiting room had a history. There were the chairs where first news had landed like glass. There was the corner where Karim, jacket hugged to his chest, had slept 20 minutes and woken ashamed, as if rest were betrayal, and been told by 3 strangers at once, "No, rest is resistance." There was the table where Colette's thermos had refilled paper cups until it was empty, and then had been refilled for her by a woman whose daughter was missing and who needed quite desperately to do a thing that had a clear beginning and an end. In a world that had lost its edges, people made edges. This cup, this sugar, this hand to hold. There were also arrangements that had become vows. A cluster of parents who had met through the whiteboard promised each other they would not go home alone. A group of cousins traded numbers and started a chat thread whose title they would not change for years. The chaplain wrote the word anniversaire on a note and circled it, reminding the families that grief would try to surprise them each year with the same date, and that the only way to not be ambushed was to walk toward it together. Someone suggested the monastery for a memorial. Someone else said yes before the sentence was finished. The room emptied in pulses, into ambulances, into taxis headed for hospitals, into silent, riotous dawns where the ordinary began to return in ways that felt almost rude. The whiteboard remained a while after the last family left, times and verbs and names smudged by sleeves, before a custodian with gentle hands wiped it clean. He worked slowly. He knew, because he had eyes, that erasing shapes is not the same as erasing what they meant. Later that day, in homes across Alsace and Rhône, waiting rooms sprang up around kitchen tables. Candles, some from the monastery, some from a supermarket brought home with milk and bread, were lit beside photographs whose frames had never looked so deliberate. Neighbors knocked and then simply stood inside the doorway until they were asked to sit. Meals arrived steaming, the casseroles of compassion that say, "We cannot fix, we can fuel." Children peeked around corners and were pulled into laps and told the truth gently, a little at a time, the way a tooth is wiggled free. People made lists and crossed them off. They learned that administration is a kind of love when you don't know where else to put your hands. The waiting room did not disappear. It multiplied and spread, a diaspora of chairs and lists and hands on shoulders. It would become a committee, then an association, then a mailing list that made policy nervous in all the right ways. But before any of that, it was a place where people learned how to be plural in their pain, how to speak the language of now without drowning in it, how to hold a stranger long enough for the next sentence to arrive. That too is survival. There is a smell that lives in investigation hangars: hydraulic oil, cold metal, cardboard, coffee that has boiled a second too long. In that smell, people put tragedies back together. The BEA team arrived with their rolling cases and a practiced quiet, the kind that leaves room for the object to speak. They began where they always begin, with the map. Not just the paper charts of the Strasbourg Valley, but a wall-sized mosaic of time, altitude, position, and human intention. Red threads crossed blue. A yellow pin marked the monastery, a small mercy to have something sacred on the wall. Over days that slid without edges into nights, the mosaic learned to tell a story. The first layer was geometry. The Vosges don't care about intentions. They are where they are. Ridges, bowls, a valley that narrows like a throat. The standard approach path traced a slope into that throat, a line meant to be 3.3 degrees down, a safe angle that clears trees and meets runway lights as if they had been waiting for you all evening. Beside that gentle line, an investigator drew another, a rate of descent at 3,300 feet per minute, and let the two lines diverge across the page until the divergence ended in a forest. Numbers are not moral. They will carry whatever story you make them carry. The map started to whisper the trap that lives in a cockpit when 33 can mean 3.3 or 3,300. Before the why, they had to secure the what. Teams hiked the slope with flags, marking wreckage paths, impact cuts in pines, the places where shards of aluminum had turned into letters on the ground. The flight data recorder, its orange paint hungry against snow, had kept a faithful diary, speeds, headings, vertical movement, switch positions it knew how to monitor. The cockpit voice recorder, a loop of minutes that held more humanity than any circuit, came back to Paris, where a room with good soundproofing and bad chairs waited. The tape had the lilt of routine, checklists, air traffic control, the soft grammar of a crew in sync, and then the rush of irretrievability, the moment when voices thin and tighten because bodies know before brains do. The BEA engineers did not play that part more often than they needed. Reverence is a form of discipline. In the simulator at Toulouse, a test crew set up the weather as it had been. Visibility down, sleet like a veil, and the approach as it was charted. One run with flight path angle, FPA. Dial 3.3 degram. Watch the nose settle into a ruler-straight descent that kisses the valley with calculation. Another run with vertical speed. VS. Dial 33. No decimal. Watch the machine obediently pitch for a 3,300 FPM drop that feels normal until the radio altimeter begins its mechanical announcements and the world outside is still trees. The sim cannot give you the smell of pine or the way silence bulges before impact, but it can prove that a small knob in the wrong language speaks catastrophe fluently. After each run, the team added strokes to the wall map. The mosaic was turning into a mirror. There were other brush strokes the public rarely hears about because they don't carry headlines, only lessons. The approach chart itself got its turn under the lamp. Font sizes, symbology, where and how the 3.3 degree was shown, whether the design invited a degree-informed mindset or left room for rate of descent habits to creep in. The autopilot flight director's enunciations were interrogated. Could a pilot under winter workload glance up and be unmistakably certain which mode owned the airplane? Did the panel make truth obvious? Or did it require fluency under stress? And then there was the missing voice. No onboard ground proximity warning to turn a misset into a shouted chance. Terrain! Pull up! In safety, absent things can be as loud as present ones. Investigators carried two dictionaries, one technical, one human. They paged through both. In the technical book, they wrote about mode confusion, interface ambiguity, procedural traps, altitude protections that don't protect against the wrong question. In the human one, they wrote about fatigue, expectation, familiar routes that sandpaper vigilance, the perversity of a clear cockpit when the world outside is a liar. Neither dictionary excuses, both explain. When they met with the families, because part of the job is standing in front of people who have paid the ultimate price for your bullet points, the investigators translated between dictionaries with care. This number means this slope, one said, drawing in the air with his finger. This other number means this rate, and his finger dropped steeply toward the tabletop. On a night like that, one glance can tell you one thing, and the airplane can be faithfully doing another. The room was very quiet. Then a mother raised a photograph and said, "Teach the next crew so this face stays with me in frames, not in anniversaries." Maps do not end at borders. The BEA's findings braided into conversations with the airline, with manufacturers, with regulators whose signatures can change what every cockpit in a continent looks and sounds like. The questions were not tender, nor should they have been. If GPWS TAWS is a guardrail that should have been there, why wasn't it? If the mode display is the sentence a pilot must never misread, why does it allow synonyms in a storm? If a chart invites FPA thinking, why does the dial let VS be set in the same 2 digits with vastly different consequences? Pilots sat on design panels. Designers flew in simulators. Procedures, those prose poems that tell a crew how to live, were rewritten to say the quiet parts out loud. Verify mode, FPA for 3.3-degree path. Cross-check vertical path with altitude gates. Call out any doubt as a reason to go around. No one writes manuals because it's heroic. They write them because somewhere, someday, on a winter night, a sentence will be a wedge that pries a crew away from a mountain. There were field trips you'll never see in documentaries. To Strasbourg Tower to understand what the valley's radar and radios feel like when weather sits heavy. To the monastery, where investigators, out of uniform and out of questions, sat in a pew because sometimes the only respectful posture is sitting down. Back in Paris, the mosaic wall gained layers of policy, sticky notes that said things like mandatory terrain alerting on fleet, crew training scenario, mode trap, chart standardization, emphasize FPA degree. Each note was an answer to a question a family had asked without always knowing the jargon. What will you change because our people died? And then there were the edge pieces of the puzzle, weather briefings that were technically accurate but operationally thin, organizational habits that prized on-time arrivals in a way that can make a go-around feel like shame rather than wisdom. The subtle pressure every crew knows to make a short hop feel simple, because how complicated can 45 minutes be? Investigators are careful with these pieces. Culture is a shy animal. It hides when hunted and becomes a friend when fed. The report would carry enough of that animal to name it, to make it official that routine is not a synonym for safe. When the draft findings were ready, the conference room had too few chairs. Families came with binders whose tabs told a story of their own. Autopilot, altitude gates, chart, warning. Journalists sat along the wall, pencils like antennae. The lead investigator spoke in a voice that landed without flourish. He described the descent, the mode, the valley, the absence of an oral guardrail, the human factors that shape fingers and eyes when minutes are short. He did not say closure, because people who do this work learn early that closure is a myth that comforts the comfortable. He said lessons, changes, recommendations, and then he said we are sorry in a way that didn't pretend to be enough. You could feel in that room the hinge turn, the moment a story stops being an accusation and becomes an instruction. Families nodded through tears when the investigator promised that training syllabi would now include this exact trap, that cockpit interfaces would be less polite about announcing mode, that warning systems would be treated not as options, but as obligations. After, in the hallway, a father who had never in his life touched an airplane's control yoke told a young pilot, "Fly as if my daughter is on your jump seat, reading every number over your shoulder." The pilot, whose face had all the planes of youth and all the shadows of responsibility, said, "Yes, sir," and meant it. The mosaic on the wall in the hangar did not get taken down the day the report went to print. For a while it stayed, a map of how to earn a future from a night that had tried to cancel it. New visitors, inspectors from abroad, teams working other cases, stood in front of it and practiced a discipline every profession needs. Humility, rehearsed until it becomes reflex. They traced the 2 lines, 3.3 degrees and 3300 FPM, until the lesson became muscle memory. A lesson is a kind of memorial that can travel. Meanwhile, the families turned their grief into organizations with names that sounded like verbs. Remember, protect, change. They learned the cycle of anniversaries, the taste of cakes brought to gatherings where candles are lit for people who cannot blow them out. They learned the schedule of committee meetings and policy drafts and letters to ministries that get answers slowly and then all at once. They carried portraits to the hill and to the halls where rules are written, arguing, gently sometimes, fiercely when needed, that the right to arrive is not just a promise on a ticket, but a contract everyone who touches aviation must sign with both hands. In the end, the investigators' map did what the best maps do. It prevented strangers from getting lost in the same place. Somewhere years later, a crew on a winter night dialed a 3.3 and saw, unmissably, the little Deg glow. Somewhere an oral voice shouted, "Terrain!" at the edge of a mistake and pulled 300 people back into the future. Somewhere a captain, feeling the weight of routine, said, "Go around," and no one rolled their eyes because culture had been gently, relentlessly turned. Those victories do not make headlines, they make homecomings. Back at the monastery, the guest book grew a new page each January. Names in neat cursive, trembling block letters, a child's careful printing. Investigators stopped by when work brought them east, lit a candle, and stood without thinking about their posture. Maps had done their work. Now memory would do the rest. Recovery begins like winter light, thin, easily bruised, arriving late and leaving early. In Strasbourg's wards and rehab rooms that smelled of disinfectant and orange peel, the 9 learned new geographies, the distance from bed to door measured in breaths, the ascent of 3 steps negotiated like an alpine pass, the strange cartography of pain, where a laugh could hurt and a grimace could relieve. Nurses taught the choreography of getting out of a chair without betraying sutures. Physiotherapists spoke a language of angles and patience. The first time someone crossed the corridor without a hand on the rail, applause broke like a small storm and then hushed, as if to not scare the victory away. The boy, older now by weeks that felt like years, counted to 10 before standing because counting had saved him once, and might again. He slept with the window cracked, even in January, because his dreams needed the cold to tell them the truth. His mother's sister taped paper stars above his bed. When he woke from the steepness with no floor, he would name them Altair, Deneb, Vega. Naming is a way to turn fear into furniture. Across the hall, the woman with the braid, stitches nearly a memory, practiced picking up a cup with her left hand, then setting it down without wincing, then doing it again while someone asked a question she dreaded and wanted equally. "Would you fly again?" She said, "Not today, and let tomorrow stay unnamed." Trauma, when it cannot leave by the front door, finds side routes. The businessman from Lyon developed a startle at beeps, microwaves, bus doors, the elevator arriving, and learned to excuse himself before the sound could turn his ribs into drumheads. Marta, who had sung a tune in the pines without knowing she was singing, discovered that supermarkets were impossible for a while. The way fluorescent light makes aisles into runways that never end. She and a hospital psychologist built a survival kit for errands, a mint to ground the tongue, a text drafted in advance to send to a friend if her knees misunderstood the floor, a sentence to say to cashiers if she vanished behind her eyes. "I'll be all right in a minute." Families healed in their own crooked increments. Karim's mother taped the hospital meal schedule on the fridge at home. Breakfast, lunch, dinner at exact times, because control is a splint too. Luke learned to fill silence with small, good tasks, replacing a light bulb his wife had always meant to get to, delivering soup to a neighbor who didn't need soup, but needed someone to need something. Colette organized a calendar of rides so that no one arrived alone to appointments where doctors said words like scar tissue and follow-up, and likely with a softness that dared no one to break. In a church hall down the street, a support group convened at 7 p.m. on Thursdays. They made 2 rules. No one interrupts dreams, no one apologizes for crying. They kept both rules with a devotion that would have impressed saints. Each survivor found their own contraption for continuing. Claire, whose arm healed slower than charts predicted, took a map of the Vosges and inked a line from the monastery to the nearest village, then another, until the page looked like a web. She folded it into her pocket whenever she left the house, a private guarantee that all roads, if insisted upon, eventually lead away from mountains. Julian, who walked better than expected but slept worse, kept a thermos by the bed so he could sip and listen to the mundane physics of liquid settling, a proof that gravity can be kind. The boy learned to bake, as if yeast and time were patient teachers. His first loaf fell, his second sagged, his third rose like a promise and perfumed the apartment with a version of home they all recognized instantly. The untold truth of an unsolved disaster is not that no answers exist. It is that answers do not do the work we are told they will. The report cannot lift a nightmare. A courtroom cannot rewarm the hands that went cold on a ridge. But answers can become tools. An association of families formed with a name that sounded like a verb. They wrote letters that began without throat clearing. We require, we propose, we expect. They pushed for warning systems, not because metal has a soul, but because metal can be taught to shout on behalf of souls when humans forget to. The survivors went to meetings with officials and learned the choreography of "thank you for your time" and "with respect, that is insufficient." They stopped being surprised by how often the word cost showed up in sentences about life. Anniversaries arrived like weather systems. The first year, the monastery's chapel filled with coats that steamed as the snow melted from cuffs. Candles stood in ranks, fire like tiny flags planted in the dark. A monk with a voice made for echo named the 87, and then the 9, and then everyone else who had been drafted into this story. Outside, scarves brightened the grey. The boy, older, straighter, read a letter he had written to the forest. "Thank you for catching us as gently as you could. Please forgive the noise we made, learning to live." After, he folded the paper and put it in his pocket, because some letters are meant to be reread until the fibers memorize your thumb. Healing was not a ramp. It was a crude staircase built by people with cold hands who refused to stop hammering. There were days of upwardness. First bus ride taken without counting stops. First thunderstorm endured without wrapping yourself in the bathroom rug on the floor. First night slept through with the window closed. And there were days of falling. An article shared by a well-meaning friend, a rerun of a film with a cockpit you didn't expect, a snow in April that laid a white hand over the city and told your body to prepare for impact. Setbacks did not reset the odometer to 0. They taught new ways to hold the wheel. Some survivors found that telling helped. They visited schools, sat in front of teenagers whose attention is a rare and tender animal, and said, "Here is what the long night taught me about each other. Bring blankets, ask names, believe people when they are brave in small ways." They watched faces soften, saw wrists unclench, and understood that testimony can turn survival outward so it doesn't rust in place. Others preferred to be the quiet note in the chord. They planted trees, they fixed bicycles in courtyards, they became the dependable neighbor who knows which fuse to flip when the kitchen goes black. The families also learned to argue well. Grief can make people sharp where they mean to be soft, or soft where they need to be sharp. In meetings, they practiced "I hear you" and instead of "yes, but." In kitchens, they wrote lists like "things the living need today," and then crossed off items with satisfaction disproportionate to the tasks. Once, at a reunion, someone accidentally brought sparkling water instead of still, and everyone laughed until the laughter turned into a collective exhale, because it felt like proof that their lungs could do that together in a room that used to be reserved for tears. On a spring afternoon years later, the woman with the braid boarded a tram. The doors chimed, a note not unlike the sound she'd feared, and nothing inside her shattered. She read a paperback, lost her stop, smiled, and rode one more station just to feel what unhurried felt like. The boy, no longer a boy, hiked with friends and taught them how to call to each other in fog. Name, pause, name. A ritual exported from a night that had rewritten him. The businessman from Lyon found that the beep of a grocery scanner, when it belonged to bread and milk, could be domesticated into something like a metronome. a small order imposed on a world that will never again be entirely ordered. 9 names, 9 roads. Some converged every January on the hill, some sent flowers and stayed home, some wrote checks to funds that made training better, radios clearer, warnings louder. All of them carried a republic of the night inside them, laws about warmth, provisions for counting, clauses that required strangers to become temporary family. When asked about miracles, they used a different word: work. The work of bodies and laws and kindness, the work of insisting that the next time fog and metal and human decision meet, the outcome is arrival. Grief is a force. Left alone, it erodes. Given direction, it can move mountains that once felt immovable. In the months after January 20th, 1992, the families and survivors discovered an energy that surprised even them. Not the heat of anger, though anger came, but the steadier burn of purpose. They learned rooms, ministries, auditoriums, board tables with small bottles of water lined like soldiers. They learned calendars, deadlines for comments on recommendations, windows to influence procurement, anniversaries that needed planning so they would not ambush the heart. They learned that a condolence letter, while kind, is not a policy. A promise, while handsome, is not a system. They named their association with a verb on purpose, a name that meant moving, not merely remembering. Meetings began with photos set in the center of the table, faces from weddings and picnics, and some from the most ordinary of days. Proof that ordinariness is the thing worth fighting for. A father who drove trucks for a living turned out to be an excellent parliamentarian. He could keep an agenda on the road and get everyone to the same exit. A teacher handled press statements, editing adjectives until the words landed exactly where they needed to. A widow who had never spoken into a microphone addressed a conference and left engineers making notes they had not planned to make. When asked later how she did it, she said, "I practiced until the terror got bored. The work was specific, not abstract. Equip aircraft with terrain awareness so a misset knob cannot become a cliff. Clarify mode displays so 3.3 degree cannot hide behind 3300 FPM. Train for nights like that one, not just textbook days. Rewrite approach charts so the safe path works on the page and in the body under stress. Encourage go-arounds. Make try again a badge of discipline, not a mark of shame." These are not slogans. They are bolts and sentences, lines of code and lines in manuals, syllables spoken aloud in cockpits where a second voice can keep a first from going quiet. There were setbacks too, because institutions are old trees and change is a saw that must be sharp and patient. A meeting ended with, "We will consider," and the room went home heavy. A budget cycle came and went, and the numbers did not yet carry the names they should have. After each near miss with indifference, the association met in a cafe with scratched tables and decided what to do next. Sometimes the answer was to rest. Rest as labor, rest as strategy, rest as the oxygen that would allow the next push to happen without flames. The survivors had their own timelines. Rehabilitation bent into routine. Routine softened into a life that, while no longer what it was, could be good without apology. The boy, now back in school, found his attention could widen again. A teacher caught him staring out the window and asked kindly where he had gone. "Making sure the sky is still there," he said. And she nodded as if she had expected that answer all along. The woman with the braid began training as a volunteer responder. She could not keep every night from turning into a long one, but she could shorten someone's darkness by an hour, and that felt like victory. Strasbourg learned its rituals. Each January, the road to Mont Sainte-Odile filled with coats, candles, and names set into weather. The monastery became fluent in hosting memory, benches placed just so, a bowl for notes that were letters to the lost, tea that waited without asking questions. After the service, people walked the path to the memorial stone, fingers in gloves tracing engraved letters until the cold numbed even grief's sharp edges. Survivors took each other's elbows, not because of injury anymore, but because touch is a language they had sworn never to forget. At some point, no one can name the exact day, the phrase "unsolved disaster" shifted its burden. The judicial questions had run their course. The technical questions had been asked and answered with as much honesty as humans and machines could bring. What remained unsolved was not the chain of events, but the chain of meanings. Why this family and not that one? Why this night and not the previous Tuesday? Why did a number become a fate? These are questions without culprits and with many teachers. The community learned to live with them the way you live with a river near your house, with respect, with caution, and with a certain gratitude for fresh water even when it floods. Letters kept their place in this story. One from a captain to the families, written on paper that smelled faintly of jet fuel. We read your names before every training session on this scenario. We say them softly, and then we brief loudly. One from an engineer to the boy. I changed the font and the enunciation logic because of you. You don't know me, but you changed the way I work. One from the boy, no longer really a boy, to the mountain. I came back in summer. It was green. The trees did not remember me, which felt like forgiveness. There were also ordinary triumphs so small they deserved trumpets. The first time a survivor slept through a thunderstorm. The first time a family member held a boarding pass and found that their hands did not shake, not because fear had vanished, but because trust had been rebuilt with new bricks, transparency, warnings, culture that celebrates prudence over bravado. A jet descended somewhere on a winter night with a voice that shouted, "Terrain!" until someone pushed the thrust levers forward and climbed away, 300 people carrying on with their lives none the wiser. That, the families said, is our victory, the accidents you never hear about. By the 9th anniversary, the association's letterhead carried partners' logos it had earned through persistence. Policies had changed. Training syllabi had new chapters. Cockpit design spoke more plainly. The work was not finished. It never is. But the arc had flexed, if not toward justice, then toward decency. And decency in this story is a destination fit to arrive at. The stage was set for an ending that would not be an erasure, but a promise kept. The plan for the 10th year was simple and exacting. Climb the hill, say the names, tell the truth without theatrics, and tie the threads back to where they began. Lion, a winter sky, a number on a panel, 9 hands finding each other in the pines, and a country that chose to learn out loud. 10 years after the night the forest learned to speak in sirens, the road to Mont Sainte-Odile glittered with frost and resolve. They came in buses and cars and on foot, survivors with scar lines like cartography, families whose coats knew the weight of winter, searchers who had grown a little grayer and carried the same rope in their trunks out of habit. The monastery bells noticed and rang as if for a wedding, because today too was a covenant. The vow was simple. We will keep making arrival more certain than fate. Inside the chapel, candles made a city of small suns. A monk read the date, 20th of January 1992, and each time the number landed, heads bowed not in defeat, but in recognition. The list of names began, and the air did that fragile thing it does when grief and gratitude share a room. It held, it trembled, it steadied. When the 9 were named, the applause was not for survival as spectacle, but for survival as duty fulfilled, to each other on that night, and to the world in the years since. The woman with the braids stood and spoke for them all. We were saved by hands and by rules, she said. We learned to make more hands and better rules. Out on the ridge, the memorial stone had learned every winter's vocabulary. People pressed their palms to it and gave it heat. The boy, now a man whose shoulders looked like they could carry both a pack and a promise, read a final letter he had written to the person he had been at 12. You did not fail by being afraid. You succeeded by staying with others. Keep doing that. He folded the paper and slipped it into a notch in the rock. Let the mountain keep it. Let the wind read it aloud in March. The day was not only memory, It was audit. Representatives from the airline and from agencies stood and said clearly what had changed. Terrain alerting installed across the fleet. Mode annunciation revised to shout rather than whisper. Approach procedures standardized to favor the path that aligns with the body's good sense. Training that practices the night you do not want to meet. No victory laps, just inventory. A family member raised a hand and asked the question they always ask, will you promise to keep proving it? The answer mattered because it was not a sentence. It was a schedule, reports, check rides, audits that talk back. The vow was not missed. It had dates. At the airport that evening, a departure board ticked toward Strasbourg. A woman looked at the word "on time" and thought of the phrase "in time," which was what the rescuers had been and what the reforms hoped to be. In time to warn, in time to climb, in time to keep a Tuesday a Tuesday. She boarded with a calm that had been built by strangers who would never know her name. That is one definition of civilization. The unsolved part of the disaster had never been only about metallurgy, maps, or mode selectors. It was about what to do with love that lost its address. The answer, after 10 years, looked like community. It looked like a child taught to light a candle and name someone he had never met. It looked like a pilot pausing at the gate to stare for a quiet second at the panel and whisper. Not a prayer exactly, but a promise. Clear as possible, loud when needed, go around without shame. It looked like a legislator who, on a late night in a warm room, voted for a budget line that funds a system that will shout at 2 in the morning on a mountain you will never visit. As the sun dropped and the temperature with it, the gathering thinned, then gathered again at the cafe down the road, where the owner knew the date and kept the soup hot without asking. People told stories they had told before and found new details they hadn't known they had saved. The businessman from Lyon laughed, full, unguarded, at a joke about how many volunteers it takes to land a plane. Answer, none, but it takes all of them to get everyone to the bus. Laughter did not negate sorrow. It nested beside it and made a home. Before leaving, the survivors walked the edge of the forest one more time. Pine scent, cold air, the sense of a place that had stopped being an enemy and become a witness. They stood in a small circle, the shape that had saved them once, and repeated softly the litany that had given the night its law. Count, share, warm, call, wait, hope. Then they added the word the years had earned, teach. Teach and keep teaching until the quiet parts of safety are spoken out loud in every cockpit and every office where a decimal might turn into a decision. There is no final scene in which the past agrees to be tidy. But there is a final understanding that the truth behind the unsolved rests not in unanswered technical riddles, but in the open-ended labor of care. The story does not end at the memorial or the report's last page. It ends, if ending is the word, every time a runway receives what the sky sends, every time a door opens and someone steps through into arms whose owner never had to stand in an airport waiting room and become fluent in the language of now. The title promised an untold truth. Here it is, told simply, we arrive because we keep each other from being lost.